I apologize for any background noise that you hear, but as we sometimes say, added adversity sometimes can offer added value, and hopefully we'll have value added to this discussion of Isaiah chapter 23, a chapter that we will title Supply, and subtitle something I didn't actually intend to continue, and that is the theme of a tool. This time we'll call it a tool part 4, understanding that as we saw Assyria and Babylon give us an example of the way in which they indulged their power in a way that led them to neglect their purpose. I got to see this time in looking at chapter 23 the way in which Shebna and now Tyre and Sidon are going to indulge their clout in a way that's tempting or leading them to neglect their purpose. In this chapter that's going to seem to describe their clout as extending from their global influence, at least one of these cities described in verse 7 as, "Is this your exultant city, whose origin is from days of old, whose feet carried her to settle far away." How far? Verse 8. "Who has purposed this against Tyre, the bestower of crowns, whose merchants were princes, whose traders were the honored of the earth?" Verse 11 seeming to help us see that these are cities that are a remnant of the kingdom or the people of the land of Canaan. It's going to eventually say at the end of the chapter, after God has restored their fortunes, in verse 17, "She will return to her wages and will prostitute herself with all the kingdoms of the world on the face of the earth." Understanding that both before her fall and after her restoration, she is going to have a global influence. Once again, the scope of her influence causing her to neglect her purpose, which God will seem to describe in verse 18, the last verse of the chapter, which reads, "Her merchandise and her wages will be holy to the Lord. It will not be stored or hoarded, but her merchandise will supply abundant food and fine clothing for those who dwell before the Lord." Understanding that Tyre seems to have attracted God's condemnation for exporting her ways worldwide instead of exporting abundance worldwide. A level of influence that might not have simply traveled across the globe, but might have endured through time, as even today, as I've traveled and looked into the Canaanite gods from time to time, I've gotten to see a surprising number of countries that seem to keep some form of Canaanite practices alive even today. But beyond my limited understanding of Canaanite practices, the bright side for Tyre is they had a hope of restoration that seemed to be greater than the hope of Assyria, Babylon, or even Shebna, as God was eventually going to restore Tyre to their intended purpose. The question was, were they going to stick to it once restored? Understanding the way in which verse 17 seems to let us know that woven into Tyre's restoration were some of Tyre's old motives, which is why we sometimes say, "My prayer for you is my prayer for me," that beyond second chances, may we diligently seek for God to develop in us the kind of character that's actually consistent with our purpose.